just like to give it a minute to make sure everything's working and going through. Ask the people in the audience, hey, is the sound working? Testing, testing, testing. 1, 2, 3, 4. Could you say something? Make sure people can
One,
hear you.
two. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing 1, 2.
All right, it looks like we're live. So, Trent, thanks for coming on and taking the time to have a conversation with me. I really appreciate it. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. My name is Trent Horn. I am a Catholic apologist and speaker. I work for an organization called Catholic Answers, which is a media apostolate dedicated to explaining and defending the Catholic faith. I have graduate degrees in theology, philosophy, and bioethics. I've authored 9 books. I'm happily married with 2 little kiddos at home, and I enjoy talking to people who disagree with me, especially on very important matters related to faith, morality, ethics, and what I try to do. I have a podcast called The Council of Trent, where I explain and defend the Catholic faith, but periodically engage in conversations with people who disagree as a way to model how we can have these kinds of conversations, which I think is important. That no matter where you stand on a belief system, I think it's important for you to be able to share that belief system with other people and engage in critical dialogue and conversation.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that these kinds of conversations are really important, but they're also really fun and interesting, especially when you
Oh
talk to
yeah.
someone who's as polite and interesting as you are, as opposed to some people who I know who are just really combative and just evasive.
They,
So,
they those can be more entertaining, and that's what's hard. I think, Tom, that we live in an age where people, they go to YouTube or they go online and they want to be entertained, and so even on your own channel, it's hard. Like, I get entertained when you talk to somebody who's just completely bonkers. And there's fun in that, but it's almost like a guilty pleasure. It's like, yeah, I'm enjoying this, but I really shouldn't, because these aren't the kind of exchanges we should be having. But I don't know if you can relate to that.
oh, I totally agree. But it's always about those. You got to get those clicks, right? So mixing in the crazy stuff with the really interesting intellectual stuff, and that seems to be once you find the right balance, that's the way to go.
It's candy and vegetables.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, but I guess so today we're going to talk about should we be atheists? I guess you can introduce the topic more.
Yeah, sure. So the topic we agreed upon was should we be atheists? And my position is yes, we should be atheists. And the reason I take that position is that anything that is asserted initially is imaginary until demonstrated otherwise. So Santa Claus, well, we should probably think there is no Santa Claus until there's evidence to believe there is such a thing. And the reason we do this is because there's infinitely many things that we can imagine existing and people assert as existing, but we don't just give them the possibility from the get-go. We usually just think, okay, that's something that person came up with in their imagination, and until I have good reason to believe that it's more than that, I'm just going to conclude it's just a part of their imagination. So my perspective is that God is kind of like Santa Claus, the leprechaun, or the spaghetti monster, just a thing that we should think is being asserted by someone's imagination rather than existing in the world until demonstrated otherwise. So until we have a good reason to believe there is such a thing, we should probably conclude there isn't. And that's usually my starting point.
Okay, so I think this is important that when we talk about questions about whether anything exists, whether it's God or whatever it may be, epistemology is going to come into play a lot. And that would be a branch of philosophy dedicated to understanding how we know things, what is knowledge, how do we know things. And so I'm trying to grasp it's a little bit of metaphysics and epistemology, like how do we tell if something exists and what should we conclude about the existence of something given the evidence that we have. I'm having a little bit of trouble with your presupposition that we should presume that something is imaginary unless proven otherwise. I think it would be more prudent to suspend judgment on whether something exists or not until we are given good reason to believe that thing exists. Because if we presumed that something was imaginary until otherwise, that could lead us to have a high number of false beliefs. And I don't think that's a good thing. For example, that'd be like Europeans in the 17th century they would presume that black swans are imaginary until proven otherwise. But that's false. I mean, I've seen black swans in Australia. To me, I don't see the benefit of presuming something is imaginary rather than just suspending judgment until proven otherwise. What do you think of that?
Well, it's an inductive argument. The number of things that people have assumed have existed that were just imaginary and we've shown don't exist, or to some significant degree, is so overwhelming that it's more reasonable to conclude that anything someone asserts as existing is probably imaginary, because throughout history, that's usually the case. Like all of the gods, all of the things we thought caused, all the different biological things, fairies and leprechauns and unicorns and mythical creatures and magic and homeopathy and all the things that we imagine existing as a part of the world. When people assert these things as being real in the world, and for the most part, they're not. Like, in fact, like 99% of the things people thought exist really don't. Like, we think that objects are solid, and we realize that after we look at the object, and most of it's actually empty space between the protons and the electrons. We think of certain kinds of things as being real when they're just illusions or delusions or misconceptions. And so the vast majority of things people assert as existing really don't. They don't exist at all. There's so many things that are just fabrications by our mind. It's usually reasonable to think that, well, if this is coming from a person, and the only reason that we have to consider it as being existing is because it came out of someone's mouth, is probably because it came from their mind and isn't actually a thing in the world. And so it's more reasonable to conclude just inductively that, well, if they assert it, it's probably imaginary. And so if it's coming from a person, you're going to need something more, some kind of like empirical basis, essentially, to give us a reason to believe it's not just something in your head, and we have a reason to believe it's a part of the world. Because that's essentially the grounds of epistemology is, well, how do we differentiate between the stuff in our head and the stuff in the world? That's like the first stage of how do we show things exist.
Mm-hmm. I would push back a little bit against your assumption that, especially you use the phrase like 99% of what people have believed to have existed, it turns out to actually be imaginary. I'm not sure I could put the number nearly that high. I mean, if you think about the large number of beliefs that people have about things that exist, most of those beliefs are relatively mundane. There is an arrowhead in my hand. There is a river. There is my child. There is a large bright object in the sky. Now, I agree with you that people had false beliefs about the nature of some of these things, or incomplete beliefs. Like, I would say that if I say this phone is a solid object, I'd say that's a true statement, and it's not contradicted by the further statement that what constitutes this phone is an atomic structure that is actually just empty space, but it gives rise to a property of being solid. So I guess I would disagree with you that humanity has had such a high error rate that we should just presume error. That's where I would have a disagreement, I think, with your epistemology.
Well, that's already been proven without any doubt by the field of neurology and psychology. The most of what we see around us is mostly just a mental construction of the world. It's not actually there. It's not real in the sense that our ideas of reality are describing reality as it is. They're just kind of vague constructions made by our mind, and they're very faulty in many, many ways. So we know our minds are pretty much faulty in every way, which is why we shouldn't trust, and we don't trust personal experience as a kind of reliable testimony, and why we do require science to actually demonstrate certain things exist. Like if you take your example of the phone, when you held it up and you said, this is solid, and then you take the second example, well, this is actually mostly empty space. If you just have that claim on its own, that the phone is mostly empty space, before knowing anything about science, you should reject that claim. It's like, it's meaningless. Like, how could you possibly be empty space? It's clearly solid. But then once you have the empirical evidence, that bolsters the claim to no longer be just an imaginary claim. It's not like you wouldn't just give it a 50-50 and say, well, it could be mostly empty space or it couldn't be mostly empty space. We're going to say, no, I'm going to reject that it's mostly empty space. But once you provide the empirical evidence, well, I'm like, oh, okay, that may have been a false belief, but I had reason at that time to reject it. And now I have reason to accept it. And the same kind of thing applies to the existence of a God or the existence of anything that comes out of people's imagination. It's just, we have to wait. It's imaginary until demonstrated otherwise, just like Zeus or Thor, or fairies or leprechauns or anything, because everything, the world we perceive comes through us in the form of our imagination. Most of our imagination is false in some sense. So we need some way to differentiate, is this an imaginary thing or a real thing? And if we don't have it, well, then it's reasonable to inductively infer, well, it's an imaginary thing.
Well, I guess then I'll still disagree with you about the starting point of the presumption. I think it is a far safer thing to simply suspend judgment on a proposition or whether something exists, especially if the evidence is either completely non-existent or 50-50 in the absence of defeating evidence. Um, if we lack both supporting and defeating evidence, then I would just say we should suspend judgment. So, for example, like the proposition, like I can think of two propositions. There is biological life in the universe beyond the planet Earth, and then the other one would be there is intelligent life in the universe beyond planet Earth. Like the one that there's just life in the universe, I'm willing to say the probability of that is greater than 50%, given this just only the size of the universe, even in the absence of any supporting evidence to that. But the proposition that there's intelligent life, it's a higher barrier to cross, but I'm not willing to say like aliens are imaginary until proven otherwise. Like I'm just going to do, well, it's 50-50. I suspend judgment on the question. I'm not convinced by accounts of alien abductions. I'm not convinced by the lights over Phoenix, where I used to live actually. Um, but I'm still going to suspend judgment on that. So I guess I'll disagree with you on the presumption of the starting
Let me
point.
pick up on that a little bit. So, I mean, I totally agree with everything you said there, but the only reason that's reasonable is because we have an empirical basis for life and how life forms and the size of the universe. And all of those factors combined with the hypothesis or the proposition that aliens and intelligent life exist make it reasonable to not just simply reject that out of hand. The only time you would reject it out of hand is if the only reason you have to believe it exists is if it came just from someone's imagination and there's nothing else. So, like, if I said I saw a unicorn, you shouldn't believe that because there's no back knowledge there entailed in that evidence, entailed in that claim of any kind of evidence outside of my imagination. Like if I told you I saw a dog, that would be reasonable to believe because dogs have an implicit empirical basis. There's lots of scientific stuff we know about dogs, like their taxonomy, their phylogeny, their genetic makeup, chemical composition, how to train them, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that exists in the claim dog. So when I say I saw a dog, it has my conceptual testimony of what I imagined and the empirical testimony or the empirical evidence of all the stuff we know about dogs. But in the case of a unicorn, if I said I saw a unicorn, since the unicorn doesn't have that empirical basis, it would not be reasonable to believe. In the case of aliens and intelligent life, since we have a basis of a life and intelligent life and how it can form in the universe, not rejecting that out of hand is reasonable because we have reason to believe it is possible in this universe. And so there's a reason to infer that it may be in other places. But we don't have that for unicorns. We don't say like, well, there could be unicorns out there. Like, no, we're just going to say it's probably just in your imagination. There's probably no unicorns out there.
Well, do you think though, and this is a problem, I think whenever theists and atheists talk about God and we're trying to create analogies, uh, we always got to try to get our analogies spot on. And I think that, and I hear unicorns a lot in the literature, or well, at least in online discussions about the existence of God. This kind of gets into the problem of cryptids. So a cryptid is a term just for an undiscovered kind of animal. So if you think about it from the perspective of human beings, all animals were cryptids at one point. You know, we didn't know what they were, then we found them, and then we made discoveries about them and taxonomy and records and things like that. But it seems to me that with some cryptids and some things we dismiss out of hand because there is some kind of intrinsic implausibility to it. So I'm guessing by unicorn, do you mean the medieval Victorian concept of a horse that has a horn that resemble a narwhal's tusk that has either medicinal or, well, the more problematic thing would be magical properties, I'm guessing.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, some descriptions of the unicorn, you could say, well, if it's a large animal that has one horn, a narwhal or a rhinoceros could be a unicorn under those definitions. So I'm guessing you mean, and not even just not even just like medicinal properties. You could imagine an animal that has a horn or has a body part that when ground down has medicinal properties. But usually we associate unicorns with being able to do magical things. And we find magic to be implausible, and henceforth magical creatures are implausible, and we reject them out of hand. And that seems to be where we would put fairies, leprechauns. So it seems to me like like imagine we're in 17th century Europe. Like the set of magical creatures, like you would say unicorns, fairies, leprechauns, that's different than other uh, animals that have not been discovered, like black swans or animals in the New World, for example. But I think the difference here is not like lack of evidence or empirical evidence, because in both cases you would lack empirical evidence. It's that one set has magical properties, and we think magic in and of itself is implausible.
Well, no,
And
I wouldn't say that. So
okay,
the way I would address that is, in fact, the empirical evidence thing. We have empirical evidence for all of the parts of dogs. Like we can the bones. It's made of X and Y chromosomes, DNA. All of the parts of dogs are just things that we have an empirical basis for. But the magical part of a unicorn, we have no empirical basis for. The only basis for magic we have is somebody said magic and they claiming this magic stuff exists. But there's nothing outside of what people say to actually believe that magic exists. So anything that has this magic property is going to lack that empirical basis, which is why it's not reasonable to believe. All we have for it is just people's testimony, and that's it. And people's testimony, because it doesn't have that additional, can we differentiate, is this an imaginary thing or a real thing? Then we just lean towards it's one of the imaginary things. And so the reason we reject magic out of hand isn't because we just find magic implausible, it's because we don't have an empirical basis for magic.
well, I don't know if that's the case. So if my friend came back from Australia, in the 17th century Europe, and he told me that he saw a swan, oh, mate, no, that's Australian. I'm not gonna do accents. People always get reamed that I can't do accents correctly. So just fill in the accent. Hello, chap. How was your trip to Australia? Oh, you wouldn't believe it. I saw a swan, but he was completely black. Uh, would that be? I mean, I might be waiting to see if he's telling a joke or something like that, but it would seem to me, or take the other example of people in Tahiti meeting a British explorer and he telling them that you could walk across a frozen lake, for example, even though they've never seen ice before. Would they be justified in believing that kind of testimony, or would it not be sufficient?
I would probably say it would not be sufficient, but it is. They wouldn't necessarily be able to just dismiss it out of hand. Whereas if he said you could go across a magic lake, then they would just be willing to dismiss it out of hand. That would be reasonable.
Okay,
So,
sure. What do you mean by the term magic? I guess what would that term mean to you?
well, it just means some other kind of class of things that we don't know about yet, essentially. So, if miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, anything that doesn't have an empirical basis in like physics, essentially.
Doesn't have an empirical basis in.
So, I mean, I don't actually know what magic is. It's just an abstract concept of some other kind of laws that could be applicable to the world that can do other kinds of things other than physics.
Yeah, because I think the reason that we're skeptical of magic, most people don't believe in magic except in a young girl's heart when the music is playing and whenever it starts. Sorry, now the song is totally stuck in my head, but uh, we'd have to define. I think you and I can think of examples in our head, but then it's like, how do we get a definition out of that? Like if I just say abracadabra and a phone pops in my hand, like we would call that magic. We see stage magicians doing these things, but there's always a trick revealed to it. So it seems like magic would be some kind of process of manipulating the world apart from the use of physical laws or causation. It seems to me like that's what people mean by magic, I guess.
Yeah, essentially just the supernatural in some way.
Yeah, I don't know if I would equate supernatural and magic in the same thing in the same way.
Well, I mean,
That
if it's outside of physics, or which was essentially the natural, and it can manipulate reality outside of physics, that would just be supernatural.
mhm. Yeah, because I think that a lot of people would make a difference between like when we talk about magic, what human beings do if they cast spells or they do certain things. It's hard to follow the causal chain and get a sound reason, whether it's a reason based in physics or a reason based in metaphysics, as to why that effect is it's possible to produce that effect. Whereas I think that if you look at if God creates the world and sustains it, there may not be a physical explanation because God is not a physical being. There may be some metaphysical explanation for why God is the reason that the universe is sustained or some reason like that. I'd like to ask you a question though about being an atheist and holding to this position. Um, is there a way that atheism could be falsified?
Depends on what you define as atheism. My version, yeah. So I define atheism as just there's no reason to believe in a God. So if you presented evidence, then that would falsify my position and I'd become an agnostic.
Okay. What do you mean by the term God?
Usually like a eternal, all-powerful, conscious being of some kind.
Okay. Like that is the necessary foundation of reality.
Essentially.
Hmm. Okay. So it is possible to do that. Uh, could you give what might be a hypothetical example of a kind of evidence or a scenario that would falsify atheism beyond just because with any situation we could say, can your position be falsified? A person could say, sure, if you give me evidence for it. But if there's actually nothing that would satisfy the set that we call evidence against this, then it's kind of a fruitless endeavor. So, I mean, is there like a hypothetical situation you could think of,
Well,
or
sure, I can think of a lot of them. Just any novel testable prediction. So you say, if there is a God and he answers prayers and I pray for a gold brick and a gold brick appears in front of me and it's repeatable and we can do it again and again, that would be good evidence. Or if you can say, if there's a God and I pray to him and he's going to regrow this limb and it happens repeatedly and we can do it again and again, that would be good evidence. Or if we could go back in time or look at a powerful enough telescope that can see the light going around a black hole and we can just look back at the resurrection of Jesus and see it happen, that would be good evidence. Like any just novel testable predictions is what I use as the basis for anything.
so it sounds like what you're saying is that if we can observe in a repeated situation something occurs that we cannot explain naturally, we're
Well, no, I
just
wouldn't say that. So the fact that we can't explain it naturally is, we could always explain it naturally. We could always just say it's an unknown natural thing. So what makes it evidence is if you can make a prediction that we don't know yet, and you get it right, and we haven't predicted it. That's good evidence for your hypothesis over mine. Yours can do something mine can't, so that's good evidence that your hypothesis is correct, more so than mine. So all you need is novel testable predictions. You can say, I believe there is a God, and this God is going to do X, Y, and Z if we do certain kinds of testable predictions, and we get those results consistently. That's evidence. Doesn't matter if we can explain it naturally or not. You got it first. You get the evidence.
But wait, I don't understand. So just the fact that if someone makes a prediction and the prediction is able to be borne out, that would prove it. Because I'm not seeing how you have Jack who predicts God exists, and because he exists, he will always create a gold bar in my hand every Saturday at 3 p.m. And then that happens. It seems to me all we could derive from that is there is some kind of cause that creates a gold bar in Jack's hand every Saturday at 3 p.m.
Well, no, that's just how science works. As science is well, I predict that general relativity and all of these things, therefore we're going to see a slight curvature around the sun. I mean, it's not like we conclude, well, all we can conclude is just there's a slight curvature around the sun. Well, no, it's because you got that right and no one else got to predict it. It means that we're going to infer that all of those other things you predicted, also a part of your model, are also probably true. Like what caused that was the curving of space-time. So we're going to assume, okay, there's probably the curvature of space-time also.
Oh, wait, that's a little different though, because even scientists will disagree amongst each other. They'll make predictions and things will come about, but then they have to interpret the data and the conclusion. That's why we have, for example, in quantum physics, there's not one single interpretation of the equations and the findings of quantum physics. There's like a dozen of them.
Because none of them have made predictions. Like the reason there isn't a consensus in quantum mechanics is because none of them make novel predictions. They're all just post hoc explaining the same predictions. But if one of them made a new prediction that the other ones didn't, and it got it right, then we would essentially accept that one just would be done. And that would be the only interpretation or the majority interpretation.
Okay. So when it comes to understanding true beliefs and to see whether, like, let's say we want to determine if a proposition is true. So whatever proposition may be, it seems to me the way we do that, there's multiple tools to determine if a proposition is true. Some more reliable than others, but some more restricted than others. So I would agree with you that one method you propose, which is making testable predictions, that's a very reliable method, at least in the physical sciences. like chemistry or biology. We're noticing recently we're having a bit trouble of doing that with the social sciences. I don't know if you've heard of the replication crisis.
Yep.
Yeah. So where people make testable predictions, especially in the social sciences, about what human beings will do, sociology, psychology, and they can't replicate what they've had from experiments. So that's kind of a crisis people are trying to work through right now. But I agree with you, like water boiling at a certain altitude and temperature and things like that. Pretty gold standard stuff. But at the same time, it's really restricted because, in our day-to-day lives, we believe things. I believe that I'm speaking to you on the other end of this call, that you are going to come through for me. I'm here in a studio. My car is white. We have it seems like I believe that William Wallace of Braveheart was based on an actual historical figure recorded in the Scotta Chronicon. It seems like we have a lot of other things we believe that are not born out of testable predictions. Would you agree with that?
Well, no, I'd say all of that you listed, except for like the social sciences stuff, all has an empirical basis, like the claim I saw a dog. Like in the statement or the proposition I saw a dog, there is no empirical evidence there. It's just my testimony of me claiming I saw a dog. But the statement dog itself has an implicit empirical basis. As we know, there's a bunch of empirical stuff entailed in that word dog, like its chemical composition, bones, et cetera, et cetera. And the same thing applies to all your examples, like the white car. We know about white. White has an empirical basis. Cars have an empirical basis. Televisions have an empirical basis. The internet has an empirical basis. All the things that you mentioned have that. So it's reasonable to infer because we have that combination of things, both the testimony and the implicit empirical basis.
So it doesn't have to be, I don't have to make testable predictions. Are you just saying that either testable predictions have to have been done in the past, or at least they are a possible thing to do with this thing I'm talking about?
Yeah, in the past. So we've done testable predictions about dogs, so dogs have an empirical basis, and now it's just reasonable to say, okay, we have dogs, and we can just say they're a part of the world and use them as puzzle pieces.
Well, but then it seems to me that there's other kinds of knowledge that we have, statements that things that we believe that are true without having an empirical basis. And so I think that if we're going to talk about whether God exists, because God is not made of matter, and he's not part of the temporal order, we're dealing with something that would fall under the category of metaphysical truths, or things that are not detectable through an empirical method. So is it possible to come to a knowledge that's of certain statements or truths without testable prediction, that they're what we would call metaphysical truths?
Other than I think, therefore I am, no. There are conceptual truths that we can come to reasonably conclude without an empirical basis, just like I am thinking of a unicorn. That's reasonable to believe without an empirical basis. Or something like those lines. 1 + 1 = 2, A = A, the laws of logic. All of those things are just in our heads. They're conceptual. You don't need an empirical basis for those because they're all imaginary stuff. And the point of an empirical basis is to differentiate, well, is this imaginary or is it a part of the world? And so we can just grant, okay, logic and math, and I'm imagining a unicorn. Well, all those are just imaginary conceptual things. And so we don't need to differentiate them between imaginary and the world because they're just imaginary. But if you're claiming that there is this thing outside of your head that exists in the world, then you need some way to differentiate, is this an imaginary thing or is it a real thing in the world? And if you can't do that, then it's reasonable to conclude it's imaginary. So in the case of God, if there's no empirical way to demonstrate it's not imaginary, you need some other way to demonstrate it's not imaginary. And if you can't do that, well, then again, I would fall back on it's imaginary until demonstrated otherwise. And demonstrated, I don't necessarily mean scientifically. If you can come up with a different way, that's fine too.
Right. And that's where I would say that if you're going to talk about whether an immaterial thing exists, then we're beyond the realm of the empirical, I think. And I believe that's possible, especially there are statements that are true or false that don't refer to objects that we can test in an empirical way. So I think, for example, beyond Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, there are a fair number of other metaphysical truths that we can determine just from basic reasoning. So the first would be analytical truths. These seem just pretty obvious to me, like a married man is not a bachelor. That one's just pure set, and it seems to be logically true to me. Before I go down that road a little bit further,
well, wait, just to clarify, you called that a metaphysical truth, whereas I just call that a conceptual truth. I mean, it's true by definition. It's not like it's a fundamental truth of the universe. It's just a truth we made up.
No, I wouldn't say so, and that's where I want to go back to. You used a distinction between what is imaginary and what is in the world. I think it would be better. I like the terms what is mental and what is extra mental.
Okay. I'm happy to grant the terminology.
Yeah, so there are concepts that exist in our mind, and some of those things are purely a concept we form in our mind, and some of those things are concepts in our mind that also correspond to something that exists in reality. And I think we're probably tracking, and you agree with all that.
Yep.
Uh, but where I would say is I would be cautious about saying that reality that it corresponds to is always physical.
All right,
That
right. So I grant that completely. So the only point of the empirical sciences is just it's a way to differentiate is the stuff just in our head or does it correspond to the thing in the reality? Now there could be other methodologies. It doesn't need to be scientific empirical. That's just the only method I know of that does it. So if you can come up with a different methodology, one that can demonstrate science or miracles, magic, or the supernatural, and it can differentiate between is this an imaginary thing or a thing in the world, then I'm happy to grant that too. But the thing I'm missing from the theological arguments is that I don't see that. They claim that there are these things, but there's no way to differentiate them between the other imaginary things. And so, as far as I can tell, they don't provide that basis to differentiate, well, is this an imaginary thing or is this a real thing in the world? Science does that, but it may not be the only way. I'm not going to just say it has to be empirical.
I think another way, though, is just by examining truths, and some things are just true upon reflection. So one of those things would be those logical truths like the law of non-contradiction. And I don't think that's something we have to discover empirically. I also would disagree with you that it's just something that we came up with, because when we create things, when we create concepts as human beings, we're always free to change them later. I mean, I can think of the concept, Robin is Batman's sidekick, but I could always change that later to be something else. But things like logical truths, related into the definitions of things or the law of non-contradiction, to me, those seem to exist in a kind of permanent, immutable way that put it beyond just something that human beings invented. It's more like something human beings discovered.
Well, I would sort of maybe agree with that, but we can actually change the laws of logic, and we do all the time because standard logic isn't the only one. There's intuitive logic, many-valued logic, quantum logic, fuzzy logic. There's all kinds of different versions of logic that reject the law of identity, law of non-contradiction, law of the excluded middle.
Yeah. Well, I would just say that my view of logic is true and their view of logic is true also.
Right, I agree, but that's because logic is a language like English or Japanese. Like I can use the English language. There is a tree outside my door, and that statement is true, and I can just say it in Japanese, and it's equally as true. So the logic is just a formal language. If you just go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for Classical Logic, it's the first line. Logic is a formal language. Formal languages also include like Visual C++ and
Right.
Linux and things. So logic is just a language we use, and certain kinds of logic accurately correspond to reality and certain kinds don't. Like if we use A does not equal A or something like that, that kind of logic does not correspond to reality. It's just like saying there is not a tree outside my door. It's just false.
Right.
It just doesn't work.
I agree with you that the logic is a language that we use to describe aspects of reality. But I think it describes truths about reality that are not physical truths. They're these metaphysical truths about the way reality is. And sometimes the statements we use to describe reality are contingent. Things could be different. It's possible we could have not had this conversation today. But it's not possible for us to be having the conversation and not having the conversation at the exact same time in the exact same way. So I'm not trying to make an argument that we're getting straight from the laws of logic to God or something like that, by the way. That's not a route I want to go. I'm just trying to figure out, for me, a belief in God, I think, makes sense if you start with very basic metaphysical principles about the nature of existence and the nature of causation that I believe we can determine just by reflecting upon them. So I think there are those analytic truths where if you know the terms, you can discover if the statement is true or false or contradictory. I also think that there are synthetic truths that you may not be able to see the necessity right up front, but the more you think about it, like, oh, I guess that is a necessary truth about reality, any kind of reality we be in. So one of those might be anything that is red has a shape. Like, I think that's a necessary truth, but I don't think that that's contained within the concept of red. I don't know what you would think of that.
Well, I mean, I would say that red is just a thing in our brain, so not necessarily, but I don't want to be too pedantic on that point. I'm happy to grant it.
Sure, sure, sure. I think another one, going from the laws of logic, might be that nothing can cause itself to exist. Like, if we're understanding the way reality is, that seems to be some kind of a logical impossibility. I don't know if you would go with that.
Yeah. So the way you phrased it, nothing can cause itself to exist.
Yes.
So just things can't cause themselves to exist.
A thing a thing cannot bring about the beginning of its own existence.
Yeah.
So, okay. And it seems like the reason we're able to settle on that is just that we understand the way reality is, and there's certain features of it that seem to be necessary, that even if the world were kind of different, that truth would still hold. So it would be some kind of a necessary truth.
Right.
So, okay. Yeah, and so I think then for me that's helpful, that if you can come up with these kinds of metaphysical truths, you could assemble them into an argument whose the conclusion of which is that there is some kind of necessary cause or explanation for the entire universe itself. So, like for me, when it comes to looking at reasons to believe that God exists, to borrow from Kant, he once said that two things continue to fill him with wonder: the starry heavens above and the moral law within. So, to me, I think that things that exist require an explanation for their existence, and that road would go down to a necessary explanation like God, like a contingency argument. Another one would be particular features of the universe that I think are best explained by a being that we would call God. Such one of those might be morality, not all of morality. I think you can get a lot of morality just out of understanding what is good or bad for us as organisms. It's it's good food. Nutritious food is good for us. Cyanide is bad. But I think there are certain moral facts that are kind of universal that require us to accede to that. There are these kind of necessary truths, and I wonder what is the explanation like for there's necessary synthetic and analytic truths, but necessary moral truths, that really baffles me, because morality is a property of persons. And if there was a truth like it's always wrong to rape people or torture children for fun, that to me seems to have a ground in like kind of like a necessarily moral person, I guess. So I don't mean to dump a lot on you, but I guess if we're talking about should we be atheists, there's the two routes is there's not enough reason to say no, and there might be reasons to say yes. So
Yeah. So my position is I agree there has to be essentially a necessary thing, depending on the definition of necessary, that grounds all of existence in reality. And I just think that's a part of reality. I don't think there's a being, like a conscious being, required for any of that. And I think that morality can be explained as essentially like a synthetic a priori, just a function of emergent properties of the universe. I don't think there's any reason to have a God for that. Morality definitely involves persons, like it interacts with persons, just like pain does, or hunger. Like you can't have a hunger without essentially a brain to experience it. But that doesn't mean there is a hunger is grounded in some metaphysical being that created the universe. It's just an emergent property of things in the universe. So morality is the same way. You don't need some kind of a being that grounds it as a core fundamental feature of the universe, just like you don't need one for hunger or pain or pleasure or any sensation we have. They're just emergent properties of interactions in the universe.
Mhm. Well, I think there's a difference between the examples you give. I think there's a difference between what we do and what we ought to do. And the ought to do part is what makes morality distinct. That uh, beings, organisms will experience different kinds of emotions and sensations and desires, hunger, pain, different kinds of stimuli. Morality, and I think morality also manifests itself in kinds of emotions or feelings people have, but it's not identical to those things. Those feelings are what alert us to particular kinds of moral truths, and those the existence of those truths and their nature, I don't think could be explained in such a way as just being a part of a physical universe. I'm reminded of in Mackey's book, J.L. Mackey's book, The Miracle of Theism. that he said that moral properties were so bizarre that only a god could have made them. And so Mackey's way around it was to say, well, I'm still an atheist. So I'm just going to say these moral properties are illusory, or I'm an error theorist, or I just don't think they really exist. But I think if people do think they exist, and there are these kind of universal moral prescriptive truths that have like an imperative power over us, I think the most logical place to put that would be with persons. Because what would you think? I agree with you. We share things like hunger and pain with other animals. Do you think moral responsibility, though, is a property that is exclusive to persons?
Well, yeah, but moral responsibility is exclusive to interactions between persons. It doesn't come from a person. Like grounding morality in a person doesn't give us oughtness. It's just another subjective view of is statements. So just the Hume's is ought distinction and G.E. Moore's open question argument. It doesn't matter if you try to ground morality in a person. That doesn't get you to oughtness. So that doesn't solve the problem. It's essentially still an open question in philosophy how to solve ground objective oughtness. And so grounding that in some kind of a being doesn't get you a solution any more than grounding it in an undiscovered law of nature or just some magical moral particle. It's just kind of an assertion. So moral oughtness comes from interactions between persons. I ought do or not do this to some other person, and the oughtness is entailed in the interaction, not in some third being above me who's a judge of some kind. That does nothing to add or take away any oughtness, regardless of whether that exists. So I don't think that grounding this in a mind helps you at all to get oughtness any more than just grounding it in an undiscovered law of nature.
Okay, well, how would you define morality? Like, what would you say morality is?
I would say morality is the ways in which we should to make the world better, essentially, to the ways in which we should act to make the world better.
Make the world better. Knowledge is power. I don't know if that is a definition of morality or a particular moral goal within what people would call what morality is. Because I think there's people who would also believe in morality, but they might disagree about making the world better. They might believe in morality, but believe in a moral rule like to the strong go the spoils, to the weak go servitude.
Right,
Like
right. So that's just a definition I came up with off the top of my head. It's just
no,
morality is just a system of values for some end or something like that. If you want a more general definition.
I think what I might say is morality refers to actions that are praiseworthy and blameworthy.
I'm not sure I would agree with those because I think praiseworthy and blameworthy are kind of arbitrary. Because again, those you could just define those in any way you want. Many people see different things as praiseworthy, and many people see different things as blameworthy.
Sure, but I think everybody recognizes that there's a difference, that some things are praiseworthy and some things are blameworthy, even if they don't know what should fall under those sets.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that those are anthropomorphisms where you take an action which is morally good and then you say, well, we can judge its moral goodness by whether or not I think this person should be praised or blamed for it. But the praise and the blame is irrelevant to what makes it good. The goodness would seem would be intrinsic to the action regardless of how anyone would see or judge it. So I wouldn't necessarily use the blameworthy, praiseworthy. That seems more like a secondary kind of consideration to judge the morality, but it isn't the morality itself.
No, I agree with you that the property that something isn't good because it's praiseworthy, that's a tautology. If it is good, that it's going to be praiseworthy. I'm just saying to identify particular kinds of acts. So, when I take my kids to the zoo and they see the tiger eat the bunnies on Sunday feeding day. The bunnies are already dead, but like if they were alive, we would not consider that blameworthy. But if we did see, somebody push a zookeeper push their ex-girlfriend into the tiger cage and have them be eaten, we would call that a blameworthy action. And so we would say that would fall under a moral sphere. So to me, I would say that because it's related to persons in this way, it makes sense to me that if there are these universal norms that prohibit certain kinds of conduct, that it would make most sense if they come from some kind of universal moral guide. And I think that morality can't be divorced from persons if we see it as related to praise and blame and things like that. Like, do you think that there are universal moral norms at all?
Yeah, I'm a moral realist, so I believe there is objective morality.
Okay.
But again, I would say that the morality comes from the interactions between the people, like the guy and the girlfriend he's pushing into the tiger pit. The morality comes from that interaction. It's true regardless of whether or not there's a God or not. It's completely independent. It's its own thing. It has its own essence, essentially. So you don't need a God in any way to give that moral, immoral, and immorality to it. And so having a God there does nothing to change the situation at all, one way or the other. It's moral or immoral regardless of whether or not there's a God.
Well, okay, so you're saying that the moral truths exist.
Yeah, I'm a moral realist, so yes, I believe there are true moral statements.
So would you just say that they're brute facts then? They just exist?
I would say that they are more like a triangle or something, an emergent property of interactions in the universe, not necessarily brute facts. Because I'm not really sure of my position on brute facts exactly. I know they're just facts with no explanation, but I don't really know how that fits into my ontology.
I don't know. It might not fit in well if you want testable predictions for kinds of things. Though I do think that in the end, whenever we make an epistemology, we're going to need a fair amount of self-evident principles. Like, I've heard you speak with other people that, like, the main self-evident principle you have is I think, therefore I am. But the problem is, like, any principle we use, if it's testable predictions, then we need a testable prediction for that, and then we need a testable prediction for that testable prediction. And
wait. Remember, testable predictions is only something you need to do to differentiate: is this an imaginary thing or is this a real thing, independent of my mind in the world? So I think, therefore I am is just a part of my mind. I don't need that to testably predict that outside of the world. That we can just grant is a part of my mind, regardless of whether or not the world is material or dualistic or idealistic. It makes no difference at all. I think, therefore I am is just a part of my mind. And so we don't need a way to differentiate that from being a real part of the world.
Right, but I'm just saying that any statement, if we need like a testable prediction to for the truth of the statement, then the justifying statement before, you're probably familiar with the problem of infinite regress.
Right. That's what I'm saying, is that is not how my epistemology works. So you only need an empirical demonstration of things if you're trying to show it isn't a part of our mind. If it's a part of our mind, like a conceptual framework or a definition, you don't need empirical testable predictions for it. If you want to say a bachelor is an unmarried man, you don't need testable predictions for that. You can just say, this is just how I define it, and you're done. You can say, I think, therefore I am. I don't need to provide testable predictions for that. I can just say it's a part of my imagination and we're done. So the only time you need empirical testable predictions is when you're differentiating, is this thing an imaginary thing or is it a part of the world? If you're only claiming it's an imaginary thing, you don't need empirical predictions. They're just irrelevant to the conversation.
I would agree with that statement if you had amended it to say part of the physical world. But people also debate things like whether numbers or propositions exist, for example. So there's a debate among mathematicians between Platonism and anti-Platonism, but there's no testable prediction that could resolve the dispute that they have. The dispute is about, how does mathematics relate to these truth values? And I would lean heavily towards the Platonist view that mathematical truths are not things that we invent. They're things we discover, but they're not identical to physical things in the universe. And I think something is that's kind of ability to exist objectively, but in a non-physical way. I think that's also the case with moral truths. But moral truths are a lot more bizarre because you could have a very large set of moral truths. Like I gave the one earlier that the strong deserve the submission of the weak. That's a moral truth for some people. I don't believe it's true. But then the question becomes that why is it the case that certain moral facts are true and other moral facts are false? I do not believe we could derive that simply from observing interactions in the universe, because those are fairly neutral to have to observe from. I think that the explanation is going to be either as some kind of a brute fact, which I think would be odd that it just happened to be this set of moral facts, or that it's some kind of perfect moral foundation, that it's a person that is the perfect standard of morality itself.
Well, again, to you've brought this up a few times. Like when I say you need empirical evidence, there's only one specific case where that is applied. It's not. I'm not saying I'm not an empiricist where you require empirical evidence for everything. Okay. So Empiricism is only, or empirical evidence is only used to differentiate between what's imaginary and what's a part of the world for the things that we can do that. There could always be other methodologies that we could use that could differentiate between the imaginary and what's real. And empirical evidence doesn't show us for everything. Like we can't empirically demonstrate that there's another universe, so it can't be used to do that, at least not yet. So empirical evidence is only like the way we have now that can clearly differentiate between what's imaginary and what's a part of the world. It may not be the only way. I'm not saying it's the only way. It's the only way I know of that works, but there could always be other ways. So I'm not a strict empiricist, and you don't need to use empirical evidence to justify everything. It's only the things you want to claim are true outside of or exist outside of our head. So if you want definitional things, you don't need empirical evidence. Epistemologies, you don't need empirical evidence. Those are just conceptual frameworks we use to try and understand the world. And so that's where the infinite regress, it wouldn't apply, because you're making a conceptual framework and then you're saying, okay, I'm going to test this in the world. And the conceptual framework itself doesn't need the testing. It's just a conceptual framework. You don't need to justify that with empirical evidence. It's not empirical. It's a conceptual thing.
Well, right. But some conceptual frameworks could be wrong.
Right.
I mean, they may not accurately represent reality. The only thing that's true there is that I have the framework in my mind.
Right.
Yeah. So
So if you only claim I have this conceptual framework and it's my epistemology, I mean, I can just say, yes, that is all true. No, if you want to say I have this epistemology and it applies to the world, that's when you need to demonstrate it. But you don't need to demonstrate the epistemology itself. You don't need to just demonstrate those principles. They're just things you've made up.
Okay. So I think then to pull a little bit of this together, I think I would agree with you that empirical testable predictions are a highly reliable way of discerning the nature of the physical world, though I would say that they're somewhat limited, and there's other things we believe beyond that, based on the basis of testimony and things like that. I grant you that there's an empirical background to that, the things that we tend to believe on testimony. But I think a lot of that is also, we have certain self-evident principles that we follow. And I think there are the other metaphysical truths that can help us, especially when it comes to the question of the existence of things that are not constituted of materials. So moral truths, minds, mathematics. And I think God would be in that kind of category. Let me pick up something you mentioned earlier. So we looked at the moral argument and where that kind of leads to the nature of moral truths and what is their ultimate foundation. The other argument I mentioned that I'm a fan of are contingency arguments that try to posit what is the explanation of reality as a whole. And you said you do believe there's some kind of necessary foundation for reality, that many people who identify as atheists don't actually hold to that view. But you seem to be different.
Well, they actually do. They just don't. They use different terminology. So, necessary just means there is a part of nature which is fundamental to reality, and that's all you need. And that you can just call that the necessary thing. Using the term necessary is a very theistic term from like Aquinas and the different philosophers, and so atheists usually shy away from those terminologies. But we can just grant them. There's no problem. Most atheists do grant. Most scientific naturalist atheists do grant that there is some part of nature which is the foundation of everything that has always existed. As far as I know, there's no atheists who actually think a philosophical nothing existed at some point.
Okay. Well, no, I think that the word necessary here, I grant you it has different meanings, but I think like the way like St. Thomas Aquinas uses the word necessary is very different from how, I don't believe it's just something religious. I think the word necessary, how it's used in these discussions, is similar to how 20th century analytic philosophers use it, usually in modal thinking, which would be the idea that for something to be necessary, it's that it exists in all possible worlds, including the actual world. That's what I mean by the term necessary.
Right, and I'd say that goes way too far. So I'd say that necessary is just whatever grounds all existence, and that's sufficient for a necessary thing. The modal logic and all possible worlds kind of thinking is, I would say, more in the imaginary category. We have no reason to think that those particular kinds of rationalizations actually apply to reality or not. And if there is even such a thing as possible worlds, because possibility may not be a thing. We may think of the way the world is may be the only way it ever could have been. It may be completely determined. And so there are no such thing as possible worlds. They're just conceptions we've made up in our heads.
Well, there's a difference between epistemic possibility and metaphysical possibility. Like you could float the idea that this could be the only way the world could be. I mean, it's epistemic, but I have a hard time granting that it's metaphysical. That would like that kind of a suggestion would mean to say that every single interaction and being in this universe is necessary, and that doesn't seem to have really any. You could float it as a hypothesis, but it doesn't seem to have any kind of evidence behind it. So it's something that can be kind of dismissed, but not. But I don't think you could do that as much with other kinds of truths. Like I think mathematical truths, regardless of what reality emerged, regardless of what world we are in, those mathematical truths will always be the same. So I think they do have that property of necessity.
Well, no, I'd say the point of that analogy is to show that this idea of possibility is just an idea. There's no reason to think that possibility, there is such a thing as metaphysical possibility. There may be or there may not be. It may just be everything could be metaphysically necessary. We don't know. So when we think of modal logic is just a system of things we think about in our head. It's just another language. It has no application to metaphysical way the world is or not. We have no idea. We have no connection there. It's just a system of thinking about things. We don't actually have a connection to the metaphysical laws that govern reality. We're just kind of making assumptions and guessing. So the way reality is may or may not be possibility. Possibility, as far as we know, is just a thing in our head that we've made up. We imagine things could be otherwise, but that doesn't mean they could have actually been otherwise.
I agree with you that not all epistemic possibility is a metaphysical possibility. So, for example, there's a mathematical truth called Goldbach's conjecture, which is the idea. I'm trying to make sure I get this right. I think it's that any even number greater than two is the sum of two prime numbers. I think that's the conjecture. Like I can imagine the conjecture being true and I can imagine it being false, but it can't be both because it's necessary. So if it's true, it will always be true and it could never have been otherwise. But it seems like this conversation could have been otherwise. We tried really hard to get the tech set up and it barely didn't work, you know? So I really think that intuitively for most people, they're going to see there's a difference between mathematical truths and the contingent truths of everyday reality.
Well, I'd agree with that, but I just think that's a property of reality. That's not some kind of other thing. It's still just a property of reality.
Yeah, and I will agree with you. It's so funny. I agree with you on that too. Uh, I agree with you when we talk about reality, like capital R, but for me, reality includes a lot more than just the world we happen to inhabit. Like truths of reality for me would also, those necessary truths cover other kinds of possible worlds. And then ultimately there's a foundation that explains why this possible world exists when it did not have to exist. So like what would your do you have an answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing, I guess?
Well, I would essentially steal the theist answer and say, why is there a God rather than no God? And you'd say, well, it's necessary. I would say, okay, the reason there is something rather than nothing is because it's necessary. There's a
Right.
necessary core to reality, which is it exists, what exists.
Well, that what exists exists. That's a tautology. I mean, yes, things that exist do exist. The question is more, why does a particular thing exist? So when I say why, when I ask the question, why is that triangle blue? I could get a multitude of answers and it makes sense to ask the question. Whereas if I ask the question, why does that triangle have three sides? It's kind of a nonsensical question to ask. It's because, well, because it's a triangle, that's what it's going to have. So when we ask the question, why does the universe exist? I don't think that that existence is a property of the universe and that's necessary like a triangle's three sides. It's more like the color blue. Now, of
Oh, I
course,
got you. Because you asked why was there something rather than nothing. You didn't say with the universe specifically. So why would I say why this universe exists? Well, I'd say that in the same way the theist does. There is the some necessary thing which has some properties which determines it to produce reality as it is. So I'd say the universe or the whatever causes the universe, the fundamental necessary thing has properties, and those properties determine reality as we experience it.
Okay, so I'd like to broaden it a bit. So it's not just this universe, the way it is, like you and I talking, this world, Earth One, Earth Prime. You know, maybe there could be Earth Two, Earth 96. So I got sucked into watching the DC Crisis on Infinite Earths, and it's terrible, but I still get sucked into that, even though it's not very good, frankly. Um, when we I you know we could ask why this particular world as opposed to any other, But my question is a little bit broader. Why any physical reality at all? Do you believe is the existence of nothing possible on your view?
No.
Uh, even in the not even in the future?
Yes, because even if there was like a nothing, that is still a set of reality. So I think that nothing is impossible. I think a philosophical nothing is like literally impossible.
Really?
Yeah.
So you don't think it could have been the case that there was just no contingent realities or physical realities at all, that just could not be?
No, that absolutely could not be because we exist. So that could not have been ever. Not a possibility.
Well, no, I agree with you. It can't be the case that there is absolute nothing, given that we know we exist right now. My question was more, could it have been like it could have been the case you or I did not have this conversation? Could it have been the case that there was actually nothing that ever existed?
Right. And my answer is no. Like the fact that we exist at all means there has always been something. There could have never have at any point or any point in the future ever be an absolute nothing.
Okay. Oh, so you might disagree with people who believe that there could have been absolute nothing and the universe, through some naturalistic process, emerged from that.
No one believes that. No one in any physicist ever believed that.
Well, maybe not a physicist, but like David Hume talked about imagining something coming from nothing.
I would imagine I don't know what he meant by that, but yeah, I would say that would, no. There can't be an absolute nothing and something popping into existence from that.
Hmm. That's helpful. So I guess then if the theists were successful with the Kalam argument to prove that and I'm not going to try to do that here because we've already gone long and I'm about to lose my studio time. If a theist were capable of showing that the set of temporal events in the past were finite, uh, what would you make of that if something can't come from nothing then?
Well, I'd say there was something else before that. Like even in the theistic case, there was a God and he created the universe. So
Sure. So I guess then it becomes, if there is a foundation of all reality that explains why reality exists, we've got to figure out what its properties are.
right.
And so what ultimately comes down to is the theist derives properties that are consonant with a being that is worthy of worship or divine, and an atheist does not do that.
Essentially, but I would go one step further and I'd say that invoking a being to be the grounds of morality doesn't solve the problem. It's just essentially an asserted solution that doesn't work, kind of like asserting morality is grounded in an undiscovered law of nature. That's my objection to the argument you made earlier.
Right, but it's not asserting, it's deriving. Like it seems like we both agree there's some kind of necessary foundation. We're just trying to figure out what are the properties
Right.
of this foundation. And if you ticked off enough boxes, because you had even, I think, even ticked off a few properties that theists believe in God, though you're not committed to it being God, like being eternal or factually. By eternal, do you just mean indestructible?
There's lots of different ways to mean that. I'm essentially just using the theist terminology to get as close as possible to make the conversation go as smoothly as possible. So I'm granting as much of the theist terminology as possible. So like eternal, all powerful, and necessary, I just grant all those terms and just take them and say we're going to grant those.
Mm.
But yeah, the one I definitely disagree with was even if I grant moral realism,
Yeah.
saying that morality is grounded in a being doesn't solve any of the problems with what morality is. It doesn't give us a solution to the is-ought problem or the G.E. Moore's open question arguments. And so trying to ground morality in a being doesn't get us anything. We can grant...
I think there might be ways around that with Moore's open question argument deals with the nature of good and whether good, I think it's whether it's used in like a univocal or an equivocal sense, because I could say that you're a good interviewer. Could just mean you're really good at doing interviews, but you could also be a good interviewer in that you donate your Patreon to starving children in Africa. You're a morally good interviewer, so they're different in that regard. But I think there might be an analogical way to speak of good to cross that divide. So like when I look at if a property is something that's necessary to be the ground of all existence, I would see another property that would come from that would be that whatever this cause is, it could not be composed of parts itself. It would have to be. I don't know if you're familiar with divine simplicity in theology.
Yeah, Aquinas is the simplicity and aseity and all those different properties.
Yeah, it would have to be whatever this causes. It couldn't be composed of parts itself, because if it were, it would be dependent. Like, to be necessary means to not be contingent. You can't, if you depend on something else, you're not necessary, or at least you're not ultimately necessary. Uh, so I think that whatever this is, it would have to be uh, simple. It couldn't be composed of parts that have to be united by something else, because then that's something else would be the necessary thing. Um, I don't think it would have like limits to it, because then that would have other kinds of dependencies. Um, so if it's like unlimited and simple, I think it would also be kind of like a manifestation of like the good itself. Because I would define good, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. That something is good. Goodness would be possession of being in accordance with a proper nature. So something is evil, whether it's physical or moral, when it lacks goodness of some kind. So I don't know. I've heard your. It's funny. We should have another chat. Actually, I was hoping to talk to you about your moral theory, because it's original. I'll give you that. And we didn't get into that much, because I find it really interesting. I've only heard you describe what's wrong. I don't think I've ever heard you talk about what you consider the good to be. I don't know how you would answer that.
Well, yeah, there's a bunch you brought up there. The first is that
Yeah.
simplicity has, I would say, there's no ontological relevance to simplicity. Simplicity is just a usefulness tool for us. So I wouldn't say that the necessary thing has to be simple. And
Mhm.
saying that it's not limited is, in fact, a contradiction with simplicity. You're redefining simplicity to be the exact opposite of simple just by saying it's not limited. And then to say that the goodness is also a part of its properties would be an unnecessary addition to the properties that you don't need for anything. And defining it simply as good is that which has some quality of being in accordance with nature or its nature or something. That was just circular reasoning, because then if it has that particular definition, well, then anything in accordance with its nature, whatever that happens to be, whether it's good or bad, would just be defined as the good. So there's a lot of problems I take there, especially with
Mhm.
all the different Aquinas's properties. I think that most of them are just kind of made up. I don't think there's any reason to believe they correspond to reality at all. And there's
Mhm.
no reason for them to. You don't need something perfectly simple. You could have an incredibly complex thing be the necessary thing. There's no contradiction there. And it doesn't need to be grounded in anything, because, I mean, we don't really have an understanding of what it means to be necessary. It's just kind of a made up property in our heads, even though we know there has to be some fundamental thing. There's no
Mhm.
reason to think it has to be simple. And so those would be my initial criticisms of that take. And for what I define as moral goodness, I would say helping someone to achieve their will would be how I define moral goodness. And immorality would be involuntary impositions of will, would be how I define immorality.
Okay, so the good is the achievement of will. Is
Helping
that your-
someone to achieve their will, I would say, is morally good.
Well, if I achieve my own will, is that good?
I would say no. I would say that that's just amoral.
Uh, well, what is the difference between if I open a door and I like it, then so I achieve my will. If Nick opens the door when I leave the studio, that suddenly becomes morally good. I don't understand the difference.
Right. So if he's doing something to help you, that's moral. But you doing it yourself wouldn't be moral. It's just amoral.
Oh, well, wait, that seems a little. I don't want to eat up too much of our time, because your moral theory could be fascinating, and it's not germane to our whole discussion about whether we should be atheists or not. But I do think that, for me, goodness, because I think the word good, because we were talking about the open question argument, I think that when we understand it as the possession of being, that helps to cross the divide and allows us to use good in both moral and non-moral senses. So we talk about things like a good microphone, a good apple tree, a good human being, a good teacher. We can use it in those ways, and so goodness is possessed in a way that, to me, that in all of those examples, it seems like something is good when it possesses being in accordance with the way it ought to be, like we call it nature. And when it's bad, like a bad tree, a bad microphone, it's lacking or missing something that's essential. It seems to be like a common denominator, including with bad or evil human beings. They're lacking something like empathy or justice or things like that. So for me, and I apologize that I don't have a more laid out philosophical argument to give you. It's just to put out there. I think that if you have a necessary foundation, if it has that full possession of being to explain why things are necessary, I think both goodness and the non-moral and moral sense would accompany it. So I guess that's the route I go with that.
I tend to take the classical philosophical route there and just say, well, that's just circular reasoning, and you apply that. You just essentially define good as whatever you want it to be, and it kind of just works for anything. You can take the same argument and say, well, there is just an undiscovered law of nature, and it is the ground of being, and its being is the apex of what morality is, and anything that is not in accordance with it becomes immoral. And so it's kind of like the argument from, well, if God was evil, would the killing people be good, kind of a thing. If you define morality as just the ground of being, and whatever its nature is that being, well, then morality becomes arbitrary. And you have to come in with some kind of secondary, well, his being is some certain way for some other reason, and then it becomes no longer about his being. It's this other reason that justifies the morality.
Yeah, and I would just say there's a difference there between moral epistemology and moral ontology. Like we're able, even if you don't know who God is, you have a moral sense to determine what to locate particular moral truths. And we seem to both agree these moral truths exist because we're both moral realists. Even if you have not plumbed to the depths of understanding what makes those truths true, just like people can intuit mathematical truths without being able to perform the proofs and find the ultimate foundation for those truths. So,
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I'd say that the way we know about morality is independent of the ontology of what it actually is. My objection is that the ontology you're presenting, the definition of saying the ontology of morality is if a being is in accordance with its nature, makes morality trivial. It makes it just whatever happens to be the nature of the thing for no reason. And that's kind of the objection.
okay. Well, I mean, we could keep going back and forth here, but I have one last question, I guess, to wrap up. Before I wrap, though, I do, Tom, commend you for having these dialogues. You've had an impressive number with different apologists and Christians. I wish you could get as many atheists on my show as you get theists on your show, frankly. So kudos to you. Keep that up. Then more of a practical one for our listeners to find interesting. What if your listeners wanted to say, hey, where could you go to get the best defense of theism? Like, where would you point them? Like, for me, like the best defenses of atheism, I would send them to somebody like Graham Oppy as a philosopher at Monash University. I think Stephen Law is good. He can be a bit surly sometimes, but I like him. And then just older works, maybe like Mackey and others are good. I always, when I talk to people, a lot of times I like to ask a question like, to see if they've looked into an issue, what do you think of the other side? Which I think is, for anybody, it's an interesting way to gauge how well someone's looked into an issue. So I guess that's how I'd offer for the other side from my perspective. How would you take it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you having the conversation with me. It was a lot of fun. But yeah, I would say depending on what kind of theism they're interested in looking into defend, I'm a big fan of Richard Swinburne, but he rejects free will. So I don't know how many theists would agree with that. And then Alvin Plantinga, I like his version.
He can't help it.
He can't help it, exactly. Alvin Plantinga, his his arguments are usually the most used in apologetics, so I think being familiar with them is very useful, even if I don't agree with a lot of them. I really like Pete Enns. Pete Enns is like my favorite theologian ever. I just agree with everything he says pretty much. Like, yes, just, yep. But he's still a theologian. I think his position is...
Biologos? Pete Enns. That sounds very familiar to me.
Yeah, he's a professor. I've had him on.
Yeah. So. Okay. Yeah. I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
So, I mean, those would probably be the big names who I personally think are the most respectable apologists that I know of.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Well, thank you for having me here. I went a little longer than I thought, but no harm here in our studio. I think we're still good. Thanks much, Tom, and hopefully we'll get to chat again sometime.
Yeah, thanks, Trent, for coming on and having a conversation. I really enjoyed it. Talk to you later.